Hello, everyone. It's Thursday. It's me time. It's you time as well. But it's time to go through a load of images again. So welcome to those people that have been here a long time now, a lot longer than I thought we would ever be doing this, to be honest. Welcome back to those people that haven't. We're going to spend the next hour going through Capture One. So we're on. Well, we'll go through the version in a second, but Capture One edits with the pictures that you guys have sent in. And we'll basically try and go through step by step all the changes that we need to make a picture pop, to make it a bit more punchy and a bit more vibrant. Okay, so who is on today? We've got all the all the normal crowd. We've got Raymond for tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow's storm. We had a storm here in Dorset yesterday, I think, a mini storm, but you'll do a bigger one. What else we got? So Jerry's back in Arizona. Jeff's in the Canadian prairies, quite jealous of that, but slightly more jealous of, who was it that said it? Bruce, damn, who's in Missoula, packing up for a trip to Glacier National Park over the weekend. I don't get to do that, but there we go. Neil's in Copenhagen, Vienna, where else we got? Boston, Virginia, Norway. Alan's in Australia still, I think. So Claudio's back in London. I can hate you less now. Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, lots of people haven't been able to get away. Just a bit of advance warning. So next week's session is not going to be on. We're going to move it to the following Monday. So it'll be Monday the 12th of October is the next session that we do. The reason is I'm actually going to pick up a camera and I'm going away to shoot for a week, which would actually be rather nice. Photographers actually picking up a camera and going somewhere to take pictures. Woo! New for 2020. Okay, so let's get into versions. So we are in Capture One version 13.1.2, which is the same as version 20.1.2 because the marketing people and the software people don't seem to agree, let's put it that way, on how they can market things. So Capture One has basically got a marketing version of version 20.1.2. So it was 20.1, which brought in some new tools and tricks, and point 2 was the 2 bug releases that happened since then. If you go to About Capture One in your sort of Help About or Apple menu and About, or Capture One About, sorry, you will actually see it listed as Capture One 13.1.2. That's the build number. They mean the same thing. So if you've got version 13.1, that's the same as version 20.1, until they somehow manage to merge the two together and make life very, very simple. Okay, so that's our version. Do bear in mind on all of these streams, as always, there's about a 15-second delay in what you type in through to getting through to me. So just bear that in mind. I might not react instantly to what you're saying. It's not because I'm ignoring you. It's just because it takes a little while for it to come through. If there are things that I do along the way or any questions you've got along the way, put them in the comments thing. We'll put them up. We'll talk about them. Sometimes the answers come from within the group rather than from me as well. So it's useful more than anything to get everyone's input as we're going along. ST's in from Shanghai. Hi, ST. I don't know when you're due back in the UK. That'll be fun that time. So Jeff's back in from San Francisco. Leominster. Cool. Got loads of you. Let's get into Capture One. And we're going to start with a picture that Alan sent in. He actually sent in 2. One was this ice hockey dude, which actually, to be honest, Alan, actually is it's a very good edit. So this is the original edit. This was the final. So we've got some black and white stuff going on here. The only thing I would pick up on here, and it's possibly something that we wouldn't necessarily fix in Capture One correctly, is this bit here. It's actually from this blur here, and it's either a person, I think that's a person with a headset on, and they've just sort of blocked part of the glove. That's a bit of a problem for us because we've got to create some content. So Capture One, by the look of it, has tried, but it hasn't quite got it right. So, if we want to try it, I mean, this is the TIFF file that we're doing it on, but let's give it a go. So I'm going to draw a cloning mask. So that's our clone button up here, the little stamp icon. When I create a clone mask, or a cloning tool, if Capture One doesn't already have a layer up here for a clone layer, it'll automatically create one. So we're going to do that now. So I'm going to choose a source, and you can see it's already created the clone layer on the left. And we're going to clone in. Let's go for another finger. Oop, no, too many fingers. So let's choose from there. Let's go into there. Now the problem with cloning is obviously it can look obvious because, well, you've copied content. So the trick with it is to use lots and lots of different source points so that you don't notice it quite so much. And if we use source points that aren't necessarily next to each other, that can really, really help. So what would happen, for example, if I went to there? There we go. That looks a bit neater. So you can see on there, I've got 6 source points. So each source point is placed by pressing the Alt key or the Option key on your keyboard. You press the Option key, you choose where you want to copy from, and you start clicking where you want to copy to. As I move my mouse off of this image, you'll see that it will disappear with all of that stuff in the way. Now I can see there's a little bit here that I want to fix again. So I'm just going to go to a new source point and click into there so that it's a bit more blended. Let's just finish that off there. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so now if I zoom out, if I turn that layer off, we've got the blur here still, and that was probably from using a healing brush. So a healing brush is great. It's found in the same menu. So at the top, you've got the clone tool, but you've also got this healing mask, which looks like a band-aid. That healing mask is designed to do something slightly different, which is it's designed to blend in with its surroundings. Well, as a bit of a tip, when you try and use a healing mask on a line that's got a definite edge, the healing mask is going to try and blend. So you're going to end up with that smudge sort of look in there. So that's why typically on these sort of things, we use the clone tool rather than healing. And if I turn that layer back on again, we can see it's a lot neater. There's a couple of bits that we might want to just fix even further. So I might want to go from there up to there, maybe into there. Yeah, that looks a bit better. But we can spend some time basically getting that right, but at least now I've got some definition in the glove. Now, I don't know an ice hockey glove well enough to know whether that's correct. It may be completely wrong, but the clone tool is going to give you a sharper edge than the healing tool, but the healing tool tends to be a bit more subtle when you're trying to blend in. Okay. So that was that image. Honestly, other than that, there may be a bit we could maybe pull out some keystone up here if we're being really picky, because we've got a bit of a lean on there, but actually all that's going to do is start to twist the image, which means you start to lose some of his arm and things like that. So that might not be ideal. It might not be what you had in mind, but ultimately not a lot wrong with that picture to start with. Just maybe be careful with that smudge on the glove. Okay, so then the second picture that Alan sent in, this one. And the question was, does it look a bit cartoony? Now, when we first load it up, we can see in here, actually, I would say on first glance, no, it's not. It looks pretty natural, it looks pretty okay. Then I loaded up the version without any alterations. And of course, one is darker than the other, but let's maybe try and match the brightness. So let's just pull this one up a little bit more in exposure to there. So here we have the natural shot just with an increase in brightness through the exposure slider. And here we have the version that Alan sent in. And then we start to get the feel that actually it is a little bit cartoony. So by cartoony, what we mean is it looks almost like it's painted or drawn rather than a photographic rendition of what was there. And the reason typically that it looks a bit cartoony is overuse of HDR. So that's when effectively we flatten everything. We bring the shadows brighter, we bring the highlights darker, we try and join everything together, but it tends to result in an image that looks very, very processed, which is typically what this does. It has almost like a bleached effect to the picture. For a while, this was really popular. Nowadays, it's best used in moderation more than anything. Looking at the sliders, there's not a huge amount that's been done there. So there's a bit of clarity on the rocks here. But what's happened is we've pulled up a little bit of shadows, 21. So 21 out of 100. That's not a huge amount of shadow recovery. But what Alan had done is pulled up all of the black. So we've gone, well, no, not all of, we obviously haven't gone to 100. But if I look at this difference here between here, which is still looking relatively natural. So what we've got is some shadow pull up there. But that extra pull of the black, and we went to, I think it was 51 to start with. It just flattens everything just a bit too much. We lose contrast. So while you've got all the detail back in this rock here, yes, you end up with a bit of a challenge when it comes to does it look cartoony or does it look real? And there's a second problem with pulling up blacks that much. If you've got a camera with a dynamic range that can do it, then in theory you're okay. Let's just have a look. I'm not sure what we were on here as a camera, an X-T3, okay. So XT3 has a reasonable dynamic range, but it's not stunning. We're not at sort of 15, 16 stops level here. So there's a challenge here. When I pull up those blacks, what I'm also doing is pulling up any noise that was in this area. Now, if I pull up the exposure, we can actually see that. So without any HDR change, let's just pull up exposure. And you can see we can pull up quite a bit, but there is some noise that's creeping in. The noise is coming from the fact that we're forcing those shadows that had, let's call it well, the official term is a low signal to noise ratio. So in other words, there's a lot more noise than there is actual light data being recorded by the sensor. So as I pull up the data, I'm also pulling up the noise that the sensor recorded. Now, that's a challenge. So it's two things that concern me with this, and when we pull up blacks that much. Number one, you risk flattening the image. You risk losing contrast, so it can end up looking that, the dreaded word cartoony. Number two, you're also increasing noise, especially if you're just pulling up the black slider instead of the shadows. So remember how these sliders work. We'll just run through it very quickly. So highlights, imagine, let me just reset our histogram here. So of course, quick reminder, up the top of Capture One at any one point in time, you've got all these numbers. These numbers are they're moving around like a counter all the time. It looks like a lottery machine. In reality, it's actually one of the most useful things that there is in Capture One as a feedback mechanism. Because what it's telling me, wherever I move my mouse, the values in RGB and effectively the average, so the luminosity of that pixel. So 20 red, 18 green, 17 blue, an overall brightness of 19. Remember, these are on a scale of out of 0 to 255. Anything that's less than 0 is underexposed in theory. In practice, there's a little bit of room you've got underneath that to pull up some extra data in the raw file. Anything above 255 is overexposed, except, of course, same argument, some cameras have enough dynamic range that means we can pull down things that were slightly out of range when Capture One first loads it up. But what it's also doing is it's matching on the left-hand side this histogram. So as I move my mouse around, you see the orange bar moving around as well, and the orange bar tells me what section my mouse is currently over. So these four sliders work in that way. So they go black, white, shadow, and highlights. Blacks is the bottom couple of percent of that histogram. Let's say the bottom 5% as a ready reckoner. Whites, top 5% of that histogram. The shadows is roughly the bottom quarter. So the bottom, let's say 25% of the histogram. And then the highlights are the top 25% of the histogram. So if we bear that in mind, we've got a scenario where my highlights does also affect my whites, and my shadows also affect my blacks. By pulling up shadows this much, I've also pulled up the blacks already. So if I pull up the black as well, so this still sits down here in the bottom, but do you remember just before, let's just reset it. This here, look at where that is in the orange line on the left-hand side. So we're looking up here on our histogram. That orange bar up here, it's in the midtones, the upper midtones. Here it's in the black area. Okay, let's pull up shadows. So now I've got a reasonably realistic looking picture, but still with some shadow recovery in. But look at where my orange bar has moved to. It's no longer just sat in the blacks. It's actually moved off of that bottom line. So the orange bar is actually telling us that this area that was in the black section now is now moved up into shadows. So this is important because that orange bar is dynamic based on the changes that I've already made. So if I had a raw file that had a load of information in black and I pull up shadows, you might find that by pulling up black, there's nothing left in the black area already because it's already factored in the fact that this stuff has already shifted. So if I pull up shadows and blacks by a huge amount there, it's up to 51, I've doubled the effect on the blacks in this picture. So shadows has already lifted them up by 27 out of 100. Blacks has now lifted the very, very bottom bits by already 27 and now another 51. So we're really flattening and crushing those shadows and we're pushing them into a slightly above black region, so into the shadows for sure, but a really compressed area. If you imagine you had all this data down here into the shadows, and now you're just pushing and pushing and pushing up here, not into highlights because it stops, but it's pushing here and it's squashing it into a very, very, very narrow band. When we have a narrow band with lots of information in, and we can see it happening here, look at this left-hand side here on the histogram. So if I just temporarily reset, we can see we had all this information here on the shadow and a lot of information here, and then it sort of ramped down. With it not reset, so let's go back to what we had with Alan's thing, we've pushed all that stuff, all that data up here into this block. Now that's pushed up noise, it's pushed up the shadows, it's pushed up the blacks into one area, and that's why the image looks flat. And a flat image, unfortunately, yes, it can look cartoony. So, a few things we can try instead. So instead of maybe doing this, what we can do, let's just reset. So to reset, Command and R or Control R on Windows. So here's my one variant with no changes. We can see there's nothing done to it. And here's the original version that Alan sent in with the clarity. Now, if we've got an image here which has got quite a lot of contrast, remember we've got these things called film curves. So not only do we load in the image and we've got the ability to edit it from what Capture One thinks, we've also got the ability in what's called our base characteristics, so our film curve, to load in the standard Capture One film curves. They're so auto, extra shadow, high contrast, film standard, and then at the bottom, linear response. Or if you use a Fuji camera, as this one was, you've also got the film simulations that were actually built into the Fuji camera. So Fuji and I think the new Nikon profiles as well do the same thing, but both those cameras will allow you to actually apply the same film simulations you have in the camera in Capture One. Now these things here are effectively changing the curves. They're changing the red, green and blue curves of your image. That's why it's called a curve. The auto one is designed to give you a bit of a pop of contrast. So it's quite, it's a good fix-all curve, let's call it that, but it's designed to give you a bit of a pop. This shot without auto, back to linear response, and I want you to look up here at this histogram. So this is with auto. You can see those spikes. And here's linear response. Now linear response, for want of a better way of thinking of this, linear response is basically as close to raw as you can reasonably get directly in Capture One. So here's the gotcha. I think everyone believes that when we load in a file into Capture One, it is the raw file. No, it's not. It has been processed by Capture One. And the same with all of the other software out there. So Photoshop will do this, Lightroom will do this. They'll load in a profile that affects the image. You're not actually looking at the raw data, shock horror. You're looking at a version of that raw data that the software has processed. So auto, you can see the difference already. So that's what Capture One has loaded in. It's taken the raw data and it said, okay, based on this camera, and if it's got some profile information about the camera and about the lens and so on, we're going to do this stuff to this picture to make it look good. But in this case, what it's also done is it's made the shadows really dark, and it's not done much with the midtones apart from prevented them from blowing out. So let's have a look at linear response instead. Now linear response, as you can see immediately, it's flatter, it feels darker, feels not as poppy and as vibrant, but what it has got is a lot more subtlety in these shadows. So let's just have a look. If I go back to auto, look at this spike here in the shadows, off into the blacks, off into underexposed. And then let's switch back to linear response. So our curve isn't, or our histogram isn't as stretched, the highlights aren't as bright, and the shadows aren't as dark as they would be in auto, but what we haven't done is pushed anything off the edge, and we haven't lost anything into the pure darkest parts of the image, the blacks as it were in HDR. Alan's just said, pardon me, on the ice hockey image, on the hockey image, I masked the dark areas at the windows with a manual mask which has a rough edge near the white uprights, as Luma didn't work. Is there a way to make a more precise mask? There is. So I don't have your mask here, Alan. I've only got, I don't think, no, we don't have a mask on here, but effectively what I think you're talking about is here, this line and so on. I can see a bit there actually. There's a, I think that's, yeah, so I can see it where it's happened there. So here we've got this nice soft fall off here. Here we've got a very, very, very strong, harsh line, and that's the mask that Alan's talking about, I think. So let's just let's have a little play. So let's just go back. Sorry, we'll go back to the the other one in a second. If I were to go onto this image here, let's draw a mask, a very, very quick mask. So new layer. I'm going to draw a mask, so press the M button on my keyboard and to see the mask, that is. and B button for my brush. And I'm going to set 100%, nice and soft, all good. So I'm drawing my mask line here. I'm going to do this very, very badly, Alan, sorry, but you'll get the idea. Because I've closed this in, what I can do is right click on the mask and go to fill. That fills the mask once I've closed in all the edges. And out here, what I can do, so if we have a look at our mask, it's not going to quite match that. So for example, I'm just going to turn the mask off. So you can see the mask at the moment there. If I turn the mask off, it's still active. I just can't see it. So if I increase our exposure here, you can see. And there we can see it doesn't quite match that line. So what we can do a couple of things. One is we can refine the edges. The second is we can just use a luma range, I hope, to try and catch this. So if I go to my luma range, go to display mask, and with our luma range, I'm going to say I don't want anything which is that bright. There we go. We can see the range coming in a little bit. Make sure we've got, oops, I used the wrong arrow. So there's our range about there. That looks okay. But you can now see we've got this really hard line. So what you've got instead is you've got this ability to do a radius here, which really, really softens these edges. And we can change that sensitivity as well. So the sensitivity effectively allows you to feather that edge a bit. But these are a case of, you've got to sort of play with it visually to a certain extent, but you've also got this fall off grade here. So as I do that, this line becomes harder. Let me just turn off this radius so you can see. So this fall off says, basically, if you are 66 out of 255, then you're masked in this area. If you're 67 or above, you are not masked. That's a real binary fall off. By using this fall off here, you see how the mask is changing from this hard line to this really, really soft line here. And it's because it's saying, right, at 66, 100% masks. At 146 or 147, 0% mask. But as you move between 66 and 146 in brightness, which is what a luma range is, slowly, slowly, slowly reduce the opacity of the mask. And that's what gives you that nice soft feather. On top of that, we can, so I'm just going to apply that just so you can see, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on our grayscale mask, which is a bit easier as well here. So if I go to my luma range now and we start to use our radius tool, we can see that's with no radius there. Look at this left edge here. We've still got a little bit of a line. And as I move it along, you see that line really softens. And then we can tweak again with our sensitivity of the radius. So the lower the sensitivity, basically the broader brush, the higher the sensitivity, the more accurate it's going to be along those lines. So with your luma range, and remember, so we've got that. Okay, let's go to apply. Let's turn my mask on. There, and remember I can still go in because that's a luma range. It's not the mask itself. It's saying take the mask that you drew and then only apply it to these brightness levels. So I can still go into the mask and I can still erase around here like this. I can still erase the guy's helmet. So we can do some stuff really, really, really clever around the edges. And you can also do the refine edge and stuff like that. So if I right click on here, go to refine mask, we've also got the ability there to really, really soften and feather it in. In this case, I don't think you need it because actually in here, as long as I get that helmet correct, this luma range here will have the effect you want. So on this area here, if I now pull down our exposure and pull down our saturation, there we go. Nice soft line here, without having to pull out anything else. So it's a slightly different effect to what you ended up there with the sharp line. Hopefully that answers it, Alan. So there is a way of doing it. So I think in your question you'd said luma range didn't work. There is a way of doing it with luma range. You've just got to be quite, and in this case, actually quite heavy-handed with that luma range because it's way, way, way down here. And you've got to put in a lot of radius to soften those edges and increase the sensitivity as well. Okay, so let's go back to this one. And actually a question from Earl. So is not auto the simulation that you set in the camera before shooting? No. So auto, so just to be clear, certain cameras will load in automatically the film curve that was set in the camera. That's not the same as the auto curve, if that makes sense. I'm getting really confusing now. Okay, so If I use, and I can't remember which cameras it is, but certain cameras have this where it actually forces it into the, I think most of the Fuji ones do this. If, for example, Alan had shot this as Fujifilm monochrome, for example, when I load this in, Capture One is going to take that and it's going to force that profile because it's what I told the camera to include. On top of that, Capture One also has its own auto curve and its own linear response curve and its extra shadow and its high contrast and so on. If you don't set any film curve in the camera, what Capture One will always do, unless you change this, and I'll show you how to in a second, but unless you change it, Capture One will always set auto as your film curve. If you always want to bring in your pictures as linear response, for example, what I can do is for this camera, and this is brilliant, for this camera, I want to always load in that curve, so I can say save as defaults for that camera. I can always, once I've saved it, I can always reset them, and I can also apply the defaults if I ever deviated from it. So effectively, I've got a way of saying whenever I shoot with the Fujifilm X-T3, please always apply linear response if I choose to, or always apply monochrome. So if you're always shooting with one particular film curve, then why not set it as the default? You can do that in here, and it will always respect that default when you do it. Okay, so here's our edit here, which yes, looks a bit cartoony. Here is our version of the same picture, but without the auto curve, which is really, really contrasty, now with linear response, which is a lot flatter. But the advantage of it being flatter is it hasn't blown any shadows off the end of the histogram. So we're going to go, and we've spent a little bit of time. This is the color tab in Capture One. So obviously we've got in here our lens tab as well, lens correction. I haven't really touched in here. Normally we'd go through this, but for today's purpose, let's do something a bit different. And we'll go straight into our exposure tab, which is the histogram tab, which is also the tab that you're going to spend most of your time in within Capture One. So first off, we can see here we've got a huge amount of room here in our histogram to push some of these bits way up towards the highlights. Now I could do it with exposure, just like that. Okay, so immediately we've got a nice bright image, so it's less cartoony than this one, less saturated for sure. Immediately it's made things just a little bit happier, a little bit more a little bit more natural, but interestingly, it hasn't pulled up too much of the noise in here because I'm not taking things that were already starting really, really, really dark and forcing them up. They weren't already dark to start with. So if I just go to there, we can see there's all this detail already. So with that done, we could say that's perfectly good, but there is another method of doing this, which is levels. So where exposure takes that histogram and it literally slides it from left to right. So we're making every value brighter and every value darker as we move it left to right. Brightness does a similar thing, but not quite the same. So brightness, rather than imagine a roller skate or a skateboard sort of moving left and right, which is the exposure, brightness is more of a squash. So it's taking the darker areas and it's squashing them up towards the brighter areas, or vice versa down towards the shadows. But unlike exposure, which has a habit of knocking stuff off the highlights or knocking stuff off the shadows, brightness will slow effectively. It's a ramped change. It will slow down as it gets towards the edges of your histogram. Sorry, your question is still on the screen. Let's just remove that one. Good shout. Sorry. So let's have a look instead then. So brightness makes that change a little bit more subtle, a little bit flatter. But the better way of doing this potentially is with levels. So with our levels, this is different. This doesn't move the histogram from left to right. What it's doing is it's mapping the histogram. So levels is a more simplified version of curves. Anything that you can do in levels, in theory, you could do in curves. It just might take you a few more clicks, but curves tends to be more powerful. Where we literally just want to bring up a load of information and stretch our histogram, that's what levels is for. So it's for stretching or compressing the histogram overall. So I want to basically say, okay, for all of these levels here, clues in the name, all of these levels down here, I've got nothing up here that's in the white section. In fact, there's pretty much nothing in the top 50%. So it's not even just highlights. And actually, here's the thing. So if I took the highlights area and said, right, I want to make the highlights in this image brighter, well, nothing happens. Well, the reason why is because there aren't really any highlights. As I move my mouse around, look at where that orange bar is on the left. Even in the brightest parts here of the sea, it's still the midtones. So moving highlights, no difference. moving white. No different, a little bit maybe in the cloud, but no real difference. So what I want to do is I want to move the data, not slide it. I want to actually expand and stretch the data to say, right, the stuff that's at the very, very darkest parts down here, I don't want you to change. I don't want you to get darker for sure. But I also don't want you to slide up. I don't want you getting brighter either because I want to keep some contrast. And the stuff here that's in the midtones, well, actually, I do want you to move way, way, way up towards the highlights. So this is what this mapping is for. And you've effectively got input levels and output levels. So, sorry, the other way from, so you've got input levels here and output levels. So effectively what I can say is, at the moment, 0 is 0, 255 is 255. In other words, if something is black on input, then it will be black on the output. And if something is white on the input, and it's white on the output, and the midpoint is set in the middle. So if I stretch this one along the bottom here, and move it to where I see data, and I'm looking in two places. Number one, I'm looking at here to see where the data starts appearing. Number two, I'm watching my histogram up here to make sure that none of this data hits this wall. That wall is our overexposed wall. If it helps you, turn on the exposure warning, this one up here, because if I do it too far, you're going to see the exposure warning pop up. So what we can do is by turning the exposure warning on, we can move our levels just short of the second we start seeing any little pink dots like here on this wave. So we're going to move it back a little bit to there. Okay, that's good. So think about what that's done, which is different to exposure. So exposure would have taken every value, darks, shadows, blacks, whites, highlights, everything, and literally shifted them in number. So if something was value of 50 and we increased it to 75, something that was 225 is now 250. Everything just shifts. Whereas with levels, we've mapped, we've stretched it, and we've now said, if you are 0, you remain at 0. If you are 141, so almost the midpoint, you are now 255, please, and map yourselves out accordingly. And then everything in between, sort yourselves out, basically. So it's made the histogram 0 to 255 out of a histogram that's actually 0 to 141. If I want to move the stuff that's in the midpoint, that's what this middle slider's for, and that's this number down here. So I can basically create a bias on the midpoint, so I can put more data to the right of the midpoint by moving that midpoint left, or I can put less data to the right. So in other words, less data into the highlights by moving that midpoint to the right. And you get this, so it's why it sort of doesn't make sense. It's a minus versus a plus. When you go to the left, it's a plus. When you go to the right, it's a minus. And the reason is because this is the tweak that's taking that midpoint and it's saying make it darker. In other words, push more stuff into the left, or make it brighter by pushing more stuff into the right. So I can take this midpoint and I can move it up to maybe there. Good. So look at the difference in this picture. Let's go before and after. I'm going to turn off my exposure warning because we've actually got some underexposure warnings in the original as well. So here's my before, and here's my after. Now we've lost some of the punch in the sky. We're going to fix that in a second, but it's natural. It's looking real. So here we've got this sort of cartoon effect, and as a result, we've brought up all this noise. In here, we've got the natural tones of the rock. We may want to tweak it in a minute, we will, but we can still do a lot more work with this without bringing up huge amounts of noise and without overworking it. So Brian's just made it from Wyoming. Hi, Brian. So Claudia's just asked, can you use both exposure and levels? Would it make a difference in terms of noise? You can use the two together for sure. So if you want to overall bring up some exposure, so let's say your image was overall completely too dark. So in other words, not only do you, if you look at this example, I'd said actually our shadows are 0 and I'm happy with them being 0. If your shadows were already too dark, we can't really make levels fix that. So first off, we've got to bring exposure up. So we've got to bring that data into our visible area, so above 0, and then we use levels to stretch. One question from Chuck Roy. Fujifilm will utilize the chosen film simulation in the rear LCD and the JPEG if you're storing a JPEG. It will not load that curve when you bring the raw image into Capture One. We've done it before, Chuck, where it has. So that's a bit of a weird one. A couple of weeks, well, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we've done a couple of them on Fuji, and the RAW has brought it in with actually the film simulation correctly. So maybe we need to have a look at what cameras it's doing that on and what ones it's not. Oh yeah, levels are so amazing. I almost use levels every time to stretch before I do any other adjustments. So just one thing to bear in mind. So yeah, they are. They are. Levels can have a lot more of a subtle and realistic effect on correcting the histogram in an image than just the heavy hammer approach of either brightness or exposure. However, just be aware, not every photograph needs its highlights at 255 and its shadows at 0. That is, I love this phrase when people say something has been perfectly exposed. There's no such thing as perfectly exposed. There's badly exposed, of course, but actually, so here's a wonderful one. If a highlight is blown out, is that badly exposed? In theory, yes. It's not perfectly exposed because my highlights are way blown out. But what if I was capturing light trails at night and the car highlights were heading straight into my camera? Then I would expect the highlights to be blown out. They're lights pointing directly at a camera at night. That's going to happen. So it's not about whether something is correctly exposed. It's about whether it's exposed for what you wanted. Now, if you take every picture you ever shoot and you say the brightest part of the image must be 255 and the darkest part of the image must be 0, then every single image you're going to have this complete histogram, which in theory, let's use the phrase, is correctly exposed. In practice, you've lost any mood that you were capturing. So for example, if I shoot something that was foggy and I want that feeling of mist and fog, what you're going to find is a lot of the data in the histogram sits in the middle. Well, if I stretch it, for sure, it's the dehaze effect, effectively. But it was a picture of fog. All of a sudden, I've lost all of that haze that I was trying to capture. So be careful that you don't always use levels to always fix a picture in that sense. Use it when you want to correct the histogram, or when you've got something that's slightly compressed and you didn't want the data to be compressed. You wanted more contrast. But don't always use it as a go-to thing. Where Jeff just said shoot an XT2 and XT4 capture one. Yeah, and it always brings in the film simulation. So I'm a bit confused, Chuck, to be honest, because what you're describing with it doesn't load the curve in when you bring the raw into capture one shouldn't be the case. So yeah, it might be worth Chuck and Jeff having a chat as to what's going on there. But certainly from what we've seen with all of the Fuji images that are sent in, it will always include the film simulation if you've applied one. Maybe there's a setting in the camera where the film simulation doesn't apply to the RAW, but it does to the JPEG. I don't know. I don't shoot Fuji, unfortunately, so I can't help. Right, back to Alan's image. So, a couple of final tweaks, and I say final tweaks. They're little things, but they'll make a big difference. First off, let's get some drama back into this wave and this sky, and even these rocks in the background. Easy way of doing that. So let's create a new layer. If I hadn't done, because it's the first adjustment layer I'm going to create, it would have done it for me. I'm going to choose my gradient mask. Let's make sure our mask is set to on. So M for always display mask, or go to the mask menu. And I'm going to draw a mask that softens off about here. So I don't want the mask affecting here at all. So the mask on a gradient always has 3 lines. A 100% line, a 50% line, and a 0% line. And on the linear mask, what I can do is I can hold down the Option key and I can stretch these 100% lines closer to the 50%. That gives you a harder fall off here between 100 and 50. Or I can stretch this 0% line closer here. So that gives you a harder fall off between 50% and 0. So I can do them asymmetrically, effectively. But in this case, if they're even, then it's a gradual fall off between 100% mask and 0% mask at the bottom line. Let's press M to turn our mask off so we can see what's happening. I'm going to call this one Sky. And with Sky, let's put in some clarity. Boom. One click, done. That was easy. Now, again, we talked about this before, but clarity, be really, really careful that you don't overdo it. It's really easy to overdo clarity, and you can see halos and you can see all the artifacts that come with it. However, in this case, I just clicked there randomly at 50 and it's actually done a really good job. So where you're trying to bring out texture, where you're trying to bring it out, and you're not seeing any areas where you're going to get any haloing or any bubbles in the textures and so on, then clarity is great. That's without and that's with. And look at the difference it's made to that sky. It's just made it interesting. We've got to increase the brightness over this side here. So we've got our subject on the bridge nice and clear. But we've also got the ability now to do something with the color editor. So I'm not sure whether this is what you did, Alan, in here. Because I didn't see any saturation change. No, so I think you might have done it in the color editor. No. How did you do this then? So, because this is very, very, very saturated down here. I think I was expecting to see some color editor change in there, but not quite. Then I'm thinking maybe it was in the curve, but maybe it's not. That's interesting because I don't see any saturation change, which is a little bit odd because it definitely has got an increase in saturation. Anyway, let's go back down to here. Let's go back to our background layer and let's go to our color editor. So color tab up here, color editor down here. You've got the basic version, and with Capture One, I can't remember whether it was 12 or 13 or 12 or 20 as it were, but they introduced the direct color editor, which is a mouse based way of doing it. So we can click on a color here and I can go up and down to change the saturation. I can go right and left to change the hue, or I can go and hold the option key and go left and right and I can change the lightness. Now, in theory, that was a really, really cool way of doing it. In practice, I tend not to use that anymore. I tend to go back to these little color things here. And actually what I would personally do is use the advanced tool because it gives us a lot more control over the area that's selected. And these basic ones here, it's what Capture One has defined is that blue color or the magenta color or the purple color. In my advanced version, I can stretch that and say, actually, it's going to be this whole arc here, which might include that blue, but it might include some of the areas which are a bit more cyan, a bit more magenta, and so on. So let's go into our editor here and say with this area, so with this angle, or this section or arc of the color wheel, I want to increase our saturation a little bit, not a huge amount, and increase our lightness just a little bit. I could change the hue if I wanted to, but that's going to go wrong. So only really change the hue of your color editor if you're trying to adjust the color. Otherwise, stick to saturation and lightness. If you're trying to make a color pop, use saturation and lightness. If you start playing with hue, you're actually changing the color that you've selected. Okay, so with that done, and let's just do our little quick before and after. So this is the undo button here. If I hold down the option key and press it, it temporarily undoes and then let go and it redoes it again. So that's without the color editor, that's with the color editor. And actually, as a result of that, with the blue, we've also increased the brightness here. So we've got one other thing that we can play with as well, which is overall. What I'm going to do is draw a circular or a radial gradient. So I'm going to create a new one and call it radial grad. And I'm going to draw an area just around here. You can guess what we're going to do. Now, a vignette's not going to work on this picture. I'll tell you why, because a vignette is always central. So if I go to my vignette tool down here, it's literally going to vignette around the outside. Well, that doesn't work if our subject isn't in the middle of the picture. So let me press M so we can see our mask. Well, all of a sudden I've got a problem here because I want to make changes to the subject, but I've got the reverse that's gone on with my gradient or gradient filter. That's easy. It's not a problem. A lot of people get confused by this. So what you can do two things. One, we can make adjustments to the outside on the gradient mask and then pull up the background to counter it for the areas that weren't masked. Or I can right click on my gradient and say invert. So if you haven't drawn the mask quite correctly, you can always invert it later on and you can get the reverse effect. With our mask set there, I can then, with here, pull up our brightness just a touch. It's not a lot. Again, it's all subtle. In fact, that's even too much for me there. I think 10's probably enough. There. So to me, that then feels like a natural version of that picture. If I really wanted to on top, I can create a new filled layer and I can increase our overall exposure a bit, but just be careful with these waves and stuff. Remember, our levels has already moved this stuff here up to near 255 already in some areas. So don't overdo it, don't overcook it. But if I then look at from here to here, that's looking a lot more real. And if I do the before and after, so here's our before, here's our after, it's brighter, it's got all the texture, all the color and everything in it, but it's not looking as cartoony as this. I haven't even touched the HDR sliders on here. That's the scary bit. But we can do if we want to now. So having done all of those things, if I really want to pull back some detail in these waves, I could pull down the white slider a little bit. If I want to pull up some of the shadows a touch more, I can. But look at what we're doing. We're making tiny adjustments, 12s, 20s, and so on. We're not pushing blacks up by 50 or shadows up by 25 and the black slider up by 50 as well. We're doing it with control, and it's the small changes that make a big difference in this stuff. Okay, so there we go. There's our two. It's the Alan show so far, so we'll switch to someone else's image in a second. But there's our before, there's our after, and to me, if I look at these two in comparison, this one does feel a bit oversaturated, a bit overdone, a bit cartoony. This one just feels a bit more real. It's still, he's still the star of the show. We've still got all the detail and texture in the cloud. If anything, we've got a bit more in our version here, but it just feels a little bit more real than the one that's got all the shadows and all the detail brought up too much. Okay, let's go to the good thing is I've got some things to catch up with. Here's some of the images that were sent in a little while ago. So this one from Dave. Here's the challenge actually. I looked at this picture when it got first sent through, and I'm sorry to those people that sent through images a little while ago. We got a bit of a backlog going on, so I'm going to try and get these sorted out. This one actually perplexed me a little because I'm sat thinking this is such a nice frame. It's a nice setup, but these people are just so distracting. And the fact that we've got the tourism signs and stuff like that, it's all great, but not quite. And then it just dawned on me. What happens if I just switch our crop to be vertical instead? So I've still got the feel of all of this, the cherry blossom stuff and all the trees. I'm going to switch this though from 3x4 to be square. And it gives me the same feeling, but without necessarily all of the people as a distraction. So if I go to here and here, now the annoying bit in my head is what would have been good based on what we're about to do would have been to shoot it vertically in the first place. However, that gives me a much more natural feel without all of the tourism going on left and right. In fact, the more I look at it, if I'm honest, I actually prefer the even narrower crop. So if we do 3x4 again, so full height of the picture, let's go that in the center there. That's a nice lead-in line into that frame. Okay, so with that done, I want to show you guys something very quickly, and we're going to go into this in a lot more detail in the next session, I think, which is color balance. So not the same as the color editor, not the same as white balance, so don't get them confused. This is color balance. And color balance allows us to do things like split toning and to adjust the difference between our shadows, our midtones, our highlights, or you can do it in a master setup. So let me just show you what this does. I'm going to create a new filled adjustment layer, and the reason for doing that, so this is a filled mask, the reason for doing that is everything I do here I want to be able to undo very quickly by just turning it off. So let's go to master color balance. So with our master color balance, this is neutral, so in other words directly out of the camera, not a problem. And I can shift the whole balance of the picture to be towards magenta, and we can change the saturation. So as you get further and further out from the center here, we change our saturation. So you can do it all, of course you can do it here, but actually what we can do is do it all from within this circle. So you've got the ability to do it with these wheels and dials, but actually you just move this dot around and you can change the color balance. So we can make the picture more green, we can make it more orange, more red, more purple, more blue, more cyan, and so on. Kind of like white balance, but not quite the same. But to be honest, very few times will I ever use the master function. Where it's powerful in color balance is the fact that I can adjust the balance of my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights completely separately from each other. That's the valuable part. So in this case, for example, I could take my highlights and I could make them a little bit warmer. So back towards the orange area. So it becomes a bit more creamy in the highlights. And I can take our shadows and make them a little bit bluer, like that. And let's say our midtones, let's go up a little bit towards the yellow, but not quite there. Let's go there, let's go there. Now, no prizes for anyone that guesses this, but this is what's called the cross-processed look. Quite often it's referred to. So This used to happen ages ago in film labs, and cross-processing was an error, I think, from memory. It was when you used to do something like a C41 film into a C45 batch of chemicals or something like that, and the colors would shift. It was a color shift. Capture One allows us to do that intentionally. So when you see a lot of these fashion shoots where you see the shadows are crushed into the blues and the highlights of this sort of creamy, orangey, pinky sort of color and so on, and it feels like it's shifted. So it's literally a split tone of color. That's one of the ways you can do it in here. There are filters you can use to do it. There are plugins you can use to do it and so on. But you can do this yourself with those color wheels because I've got the ability to change the entire color balance of everything in the highlights, everything in the midtones, and everything in the shadows independently of each other. So if I go before and after, we can see that we're trying to style some of this stuff. Now here's the fun thing. Let's create a new variant and I'll clone that variant. So I'm going to reset this variant. Oops, no, I'm not. I am going to delete my layer there of the white balance or color balance. Think about what styles do. So if I go to my styles tab, let's go to, oh, here we go, Spring 06. Okay. Let's go into our color tab. Look what they've done. Look what Spring 06 is. So quite often you'll see all these styles and think, have they done that with white balance? Have they done it with HDR? Have they done it with all of the stuff that you've got as obvious tools? Have a look in the color balance section under the three-way sliders and see what they've done to the shadows, to the midtones and the highlights. And you'll see that dot is moving around. That's how you get these cross-processed looks. So let's go to, in fact, let's go to Beyond Film. So that's the current one that's out. And let's look at maybe that one there. So K200 number 1. Now, of course, in this simulation, we've got some contrast change, we've got some HDR stuff, we've got a little bit of clarity work in there as well, a bit of curve work too, but let's have a look in our color balance. They've shifted the color balance. So in every case where you're seeing an image change color, not change color in terms of white balance or so on, but you're seeing these shifts where it's a split tone between why have all of a sudden the highlights become creamier or bluer and colder when the shadows are staying the same? It's because they've gone into that three-way color balance and they've adjusted the balance of the shadows, the highlights, and the midtones. This is really, really useful when you're trying to stylize your images. So for example, when people are trying to do things like the blue and teal or the teal and orange look and so on, you can do some of that with color balance. It's not quite the same. We've actually covered it in a one of the YouTube pro tips. There's one that we did about styles and presets. In there, if you want to see how to do an orange and teal effect, it's in there. There's actually a recipe in there for exactly how to do it. But it's all a variation on the same theory, which is we're adjusting shadows, highlights, midtones independently of each other, and we're changing the colors of each of them. And what you end up with is this really nice effect, if you get it right, where you can make things feel a bit more washed out, a bit more spring-like or something like that, rather than completely daylight and cold. So on this one, I'm quite liking that style. So that's just been dialed in directly. So quite a push on the highlights towards the orange area, quite a push on the shadows towards the blues. So we've got that, and that's what we refer to as split tones. So you've got the highlights and shadows going in opposite directions. And then in the midtones, we've got a little bit of warming going on. On top of that, let's go into our exposure tab, because what I can see up here, got a little bit of the cherry blossom stuff that's a little bit blown out. In theory, we could use linear response. In practice, just quickly now, let's just pull down our whites a little touch, and we should pull back some of that detail. Yeah, I think looking at this, either they were moving or we've got a little bit of focus challenge in there, maybe a little bit. But in terms of it at 100%, let's just have a look. It looks pretty sharp, just got a little bit of movement maybe in that branch. So overall, that looks pretty nice. The only thing I would add on top of this is potentially one of these radial masks. Now again, not a vignette. So a vignette is going to give me a perfectly dark corner down here and here, but also up here and here. I don't want that. I want to lead them up to that cherry blossom. So let's reset our vignette, new layer. I'm going to call this one top vignette. And I'm going to draw a wonderful mask like that. Remember, you don't have to have the whole mask on the middle of the screen. And unlike before, where I wanted this to be the subject and I then inverted it, in this case, I want to affect this area down here. So because of that, I don't need to invert the mask. All I'm going to do is pull down brightness on that area here. And now we've got a nice warm lead up into those trees. So that's my job on that one. If I create a new variant of this, so here is the original. Nothing wrong with that original, apart from it just feels like a snap because you've got all the people around it. Now, if you wanted to capture the people, it would feel more intentional. These just feel like people that are there and happen to be there, which is why I think this crop here on the left, so this is our edit, with that color balance adjustment, with the little shift in shadows and highlights, and that different crop, is a lot stronger as a picture than the one on the right. And if we want this even brighter still, of course, don't forget you can go back to background and we can push our brightness up a touch as well. Okay, cool. One quick one. We've got 5 minutes. Let's have a look at Bob's image here. Where are we? F2. Okay. So nice picture. Nice and sharp, I think, on our leaves. Yeah, really sharp in there. We just want to bring something into this side here and maybe brighten this area on the left-hand side. So first thing, I'm going to pull in a little bit of a gradient here. So I'm just clicking it very quickly there just to bring in a gradient on the side. And with that gradient, I'm going to increase our exposure, but I'm also going to increase the warmth. See the difference that's made? And then that's going to be called right hand warm. And in the top left, we're going to create another gradient called top left brighten. So you can guess what we're going to do with this section. I'm going to draw in a nice soft gradient again. So again, I want it softly falling off, gradient there. And with that one, I'm just going to increase our brightness a touch. Actually, not too much on the brightness. We're just going to use actually our shadows. There we go, into there. And I'm going to create one final one, which is bottom left darken. So this sounds a bit weird that we're doing all these sort of overlapping gradients, but there is a method to it, which is I'm trying to isolate this set of leaves and keep the background nice and warm at the same time. So with this, I'm going to, well, I could use exposure, I could use brightness, or I'm just going to pull down, ironically, our shadows a bit more there. Cool. Now I'm actually going to pull in a crop just the right size though, 2x3 is a bit better. And there we go. There, we can go in a little bit tighter into there. I want to get all of this color variation in here. I might even want to delete that leaf up here. We'll have a look. There, that just feels nicer. I would delete that leaf. Let's just create a new, let's do a quick healing there. I'm going to answer a couple of questions. I'm just conscious of time. So a quick heal there up here. And that's done an okay job, but I want it to do a better job. So let's go into there. That's looking pretty good. Okay. So really quick edit, but let's just create a new variant. So sorry, let's just turn off my filter because I've got a filter on there. So there is our new variant. So that's the original. And that's our edit. Really quick, but it's just a case of cropping it down, keeping it tight, getting those colors. You see how this has now got a much more warming pop of color, and it's from that layer, which we said was this right hand warm, and all that was a little bit of exposure boost and a bit of Kelvin change as well on the white balance, and that's it. If we just want to see our edit on its own without the difference in crop, you can see it's very small. There's our before, there's our after. We haven't touched these leaves, which is the interesting bit. What we have done is brought around darkness down here, brightness up here, just to make sure we've got these nice, strong, bold color blocks in something that would actually fit on a wall as a big print above a bed or something like that, and look quite nice. Okay, so what do we have on there? Question from Serge. What's the difference between color balance and LUTs? So LUTs, lookup tables. Effectively, in practice of what you can do with them, not a lot actually. So and not in isolation. So a lookup table has other stuff too, but Lookup table typically is also doing similar things. So it's also, when you load in a LUT into something like a video editing software, it's doing that. It's doing the shifting of colors for shadows and highlights and so on. It's taking color values and it's shifting them up or down in hue and saturation. That's what it is. It's a lookup table for a color reference, which is effectively what you're building when you're doing the color balance in Capture One. That plus other tools. Where were we? Chili Cayenne. I would still be interested in Paul showing how we'd use Capture One specifically on some medium format films scanned and what constraints there are. So send one in. Is the answer. So make a note, please, when you send it in that it's as a scanned TIFF. Otherwise, we'll look at it and go, ooh, that's not a raw. You are limited in certain things you can do with it, but by all means, scan one in. Send me the TIFF. We'll go through that in a second, and we can have a play with it next time. Okay, so in the meantime, you will see there is still a Facebook group on there. All this content, this video is going into that Facebook group later on when it's finished processing. You'll be able to have a chat amongst yourselves, including the stuff between where are we, Jeff and Chuck and Chili and so on about film scanning, but also the Fuji camera stuff. It'd be good to get to the bottom of that somehow. And we will see, hopefully, not next week, it'll be the 12th of October, the next live session that we do. So send in your images in the meantime. Remember to use that upload tool. If you want to have a look at film scanning stuff, then by all means do send in your film scans and we'll have a play with them. We can talk about the limitations you've got. Also, remember you've got those YouTube pro tips guides and includes, so if you want to have a look at, for example, the Capture One equivalent of a LUT for orange and teal, it's under the styles and presets thing. But in the meantime, sorry, you couldn't hear me there for a second. Failing that, we will see you on the 12th of October. Same time, same place, but it's a Monday. So we'll catch you then. Cheers. Bye.